we finished up community indifference curves in the last segment. There's a few things that we need to clean up here. Marginal rate of substitution is the rate at which you're willing to trade one for the other. We mentioned that in the last lecture. And notice it's diminishing. The diminishing marginal rate of substitution is that convexity. It just says that the slope diminishes as you move from the left to the right along those indifference curves. And ultimately what the diminishing marginal rate of substitution means is that you tend to prefer a balance in your consumption. It's that idea. So that's the snazzy math sounding name for something that's a very typical human behavior. We've talked about the preference axioms. Terms of trade just simply have to do with how many imports we get for exports. I mentioned that in a previous lecture as well. Notice that the terms of trade can improve or deteriorate. You can get more imports for the same number of exports. That's an improvement in your terms of trade. Or you can get fewer imports for the same number of exports, and that would be a deterioration in the terms of trade. A lot of this stuff in here about the theory of reciprocal demand and the terms of trade formula stuff, I'm not super interested in that. I do want you to know that the terms of trade are not just there because I say they're there. In the real world, the terms of trade are worked out in the market based on prices. So that you look at the price of imports relative to the price of exports, and as those prices change, the terms of trade change. What determines those prices? Well, it's supply and demand. So there's a lot that goes into that. John Stuart Mill, J.S. Mill, back in the 1800s, came up with an idea as to how the terms of trade were determined. And he said it has to do with the overlapping demands of two countries engaged in trade. So, for instance, if you have two countries trading with one another, one has a large demand for the other's products, the other has a relatively smaller demand for the former's products, that's going to change the prices. The higher demand is going to push the prices up in the smaller country, and that's going to actually deteriorate the terms of trade for the larger country. So the theory of reciprocal demand said that trade, in terms of the terms of trade, tends to favor the smaller country, the country with the smaller demand, because their small demand keeps prices in check, whereas the other country's large demand kind of balloons the price of imports, and that hurts their terms of trade. So that's just a basic idea. Make sure you have a look at that and get a basic understanding of that. The only problem with the theory of reciprocal demands is it focuses only on the demand side and not the supply side, because prices are not just determined by demand, they're determined by the interaction of supply and demand. So that's all that is. So those are some more little things. We mentioned autarky. That was a hypothetical state where two countries don't trade with one another. It's the state of isolation. It's the starting point for all of our trade models, and then we open them up to trade. And then increasing costs had to do with that bowed outward production possibility curve, this idea. When we went to two types of labor in that previous example, we saw that production possibility curves are bowed outward, and that gives us that idea of partial specialization instead of complete specialization. And that's everything we need to move forward with modern trade theory. Modern trade theory is referred to as factor endowment theory. An example of factor endowment theory is the Heckscher-Ohlin trade model. And the Heckscher-Ohlin trade model was the first instance of modern trade theory. And as I mentioned, we had gone through the Industrial Revolution by this point. By the time modern trade theory comes around, I just locked someone out. We had gone through the Industrial Revolution. Now recall, one of the assumptions of traditional or classical trade theory was that labor theory of value, that labor was the only factor of production. But the Industrial Revolution did something to that idea. It said, yeah, that's a great idea. The problem is that after the Industrial Revolution, is it just people making things? No, now we've got the assembly line, right? Now we've got machinery. Now we've got factories, which are a huge component. And what did the assembly line in the production facility that Henry Ford thought of, what did that do to the production of cars? and sped it up dramatically. It increased our productive capacity a lot. So what really started happening? Well, this confluence of man and machine, bringing together workers with physical capital, made both extremely important in the production process. And so economics as a science incorporated that and started coming up with more complex production functions that included both labor and capital, and not this old idea of just labor theory of value where labor was all that mattered. As a consequence, Heckscher and Olin, two Scandinavian economists, get together and they say, well, why don't we update classical trade theory? If you recall, classical trade theory was a 2x2x1 model, two countries, two goods, one factor of production labor, and they said, let's make this a 2x2x2 model. Let's bring in not just labor, but physical capital. So now we've got two factors of production, labor and capital. And interestingly enough, that's not where the discussion ends, it's only where it begins, because the second that you start talking about labor and capital being your two factors of production, it says something about the two goods that you're going to be producing. Actually, you have to clean up something there. Because as it turns out, some goods that we produce are very labor intensive in their production. Some goods require a lot of labor input, but machines don't really work too well for those types of goods. Conversely, some other goods tend to be more capital intensive in their production. They need more machinery, and people don't really help that much. So you might think of like shoes as being labor intensive. Machines aren't really great. They are now, but historically machines were not very good at making shoes, so a lot of labor had to go into making shoes. A better example might be a couple of agricultural goods, wheat and rice. Think about the image you have of wheat harvesting. Is it a bunch of people out there picking wheat by hand? What do you have? Big old combine harvester, and hell, they're probably remote controlled now to GPS navigate. You don't even need a driver, right? It's just completely automated. That idea that says that wheat is very capital intensive in its production. So if you want more wheat, what do you need? More machines, exactly. Now think about traditionally what it's like to harvest rice. What if you take that big combine harvester and go try to harvest rice with it? What's going to happen to that combine harvester? It's going to sink. Why?
Because it grows in water.
Yeah, because rice grows in rice paddies, and you can't just drive a big piece of equipment through there without bogging it down. So what's the image of rice being harvested? Think Southeast Asia. Yeah, a lot of people with rudimentary tools out there gathering rice by hand. So we would say in this example, and this is probably a little bit oversimplified, I'm not exactly sure what the current state of rice production is around the world, but I imagine that's not too far from the truth still. It suggests that going with this example suggests that rice is very labor intensive in its production, whereas wheat is very capital intensive. So Heckscher and Olin had to come up with the two goods, and they said, well, let's choose one that's capital intensive and one that's labor intensive. So let's go with that rice and wheat. But then we also have to say something about the two countries. It's called factor endowment theory because what we're talking about here is having two factors of production. When you have two countries, you have to endow them with a certain amount of labor and a certain amount of capital, and we could give them equal amounts of capital and labor, but a more realistic assumption is to assume that some countries are labor abundant / capital scarce, whereas others are capital abundant or labor scarce. So if we think about one of the two countries being labor abundant and one being capital abundant, the model starts to kind of build itself. Chew on that for a second. Let's take two countries, China and the U.S. Which do you think is going to be the labor abundant country between those two? Yeah, now it's not just because they have 5 times the number of people as us. That helps. Really the way you measure labor abundance or capital abundance is by the ratio of capital to labor. So the country with the higher capital to labor ratio is the more capital abundant country. The person with the lower capital to labor ratio is the labor abundant country. So that's what's important. But again, it's just kind of brute force. It's easy to think, okay, China's a labor abundant country because they have a lot of people, relatively little capital. The U.S. is capital abundant. We have a lot of machines, relatively fewer people. And that means two things. When you have an abundance of something, what's the price of it? It's cheap. So in China, labor is going to be cheap because it's abundant. In the U.S., capital is going to be relatively cheap because it's abundant. Labor is going to be a little more expensive in the U.S. because it's relatively more scarce. And now we're starting to see, wait, this sounds kind of like the real world, doesn't it? There's a lot of reality that's creeping into our models here, and that's kind of the point. Do you see how the model's building itself? You got two goods, one that's rice that's labor intensive in its production, one that's wheat that's capital intensive. You got two countries, one that's labor abundant where labor is cheap. So right off the top, what are we going to be able to kind of figure out here? It looks like, without knowing much about what this model is going to look like at this point, we can guess that China is going to want to specialize in the production of rice because their resources are cheap and better suited for the production of rice. What are we talking about here? We're talking about a source for comparative advantage. Because we know that comparative advantage from our previous lessons has to do not with the ability to produce a lot, it has everything to do with the cost of production, specifically the opportunity cost of production. But now we're starting to kind of hone in on what this means in the real world. China has a comparative advantage in the production of rice in this example because their resources are abundant and available and better suited for that. On the other hand, it would be very expensive for China to make a bunch of wheat. Why? Because labor is not well suited to the production of wheat, and they don't have the physical capital that is better suited for it. That's the U.S.'s domain. So what we've done is we've gone one level deeper. If you think about where we're at this point, the previous trade models we talked about said, hey, the gains from trade come from comparative advantage. That's what we learned with Ricardo's model, that ultimately it's comparative advantage that gives rise to the gains from trade. And what have we just shown? Hey, it's factor endowment, the factors that you're endowed with and the way that products are made better with labor and or capital depending on the product. It's that factor endowment that determines where your comparative advantage is. So we've just gone one level deeper and we've found the source of comparative advantage. This model gives us an example of the source of comparative advantage. And after that, it's pretty straightforward to draw these models. And this should look very familiar to you based on our other models. Let's do the U.S., let's do China. Let's do wheat up here and rice down here, wheat up there and rice here. And what we will find is that the U.S. has that, and China looks something like that. Notice what I did with the production possibility curves, and also think back to our first example, Adam Smith's absolute advantage model with beer and wine. Does it look familiar? It's really the same thing, but we've added one little feature, which is instead of having these perfectly flat, continuous cost, constant cost models, we have these bowed outward increasing cost examples because we have two factors of production. So for the same reason we had doctors and farmers causing that production possibility curve to be bowed outward, we've got the same thing going on here. It's the same idea. It's just using capital and labor instead of two different types of labor. Secondly, notice that it's kind of skewed. You can kind of see where there's a comparative advantage in the production of wheat. Just like I said before, that it tends to kind of point towards the comparative advantage, you can kind of see that going on here, even though it's bowed outward. Question is, where do we start? Well, one assumption in this model is that each country has the same preferences. They both like wheat and rice the same, both in the U.S. and China. And all that means is that we have the same community indifference curve for each country. So you can just lift that community indifference curve and drop it right on this. It's a mirror, it's not a mirror. It's a replica. It's a duplicate image. And that says that in autarky, in isolation, if the U.S. is maximizing its social welfare, it's producing at point A, whereas China is producing at their point A over here. That gives us a starting point, that kind of middle point that we've started in all these models. But if you notice something, at that point, look at the, looks to be about 2 to 1 there. Looks to be about 1 to 2 down here. The slope at that point is pretty steep over here in the US, and it's fairly flat over there in China. And that means this. If the U.S. wants to specialize in wheat, at this point at least, they can get about 2 bushels of wheat for 1 bushel of rice. Does rice come in bushels?
Probably, it would probably measure bushels.
Or bags?
Pounds, maybe.
Pounds of rice? Let's call them bushels. This is for all of history. This will be recorded. I've created a new metric for rice, bushels. How about over here? If China wants to make wheat, they can only get 1 for 2. So now we're seeing that comparative advantage, that opportunity cost crop up. And since the U.S. is getting 2 for 1 in wheat, but China is not very good, but they're getting 2 for 1 in rice, guess what each country wants to do? They're going to want to specialize and trade. And so they specialize in this direction. They go to about right here. Call that point B. And notice something. It's about 1 to 1 there. Not super to scale here, but you get the idea. They go to point B there, and they're about 1 to 1. So by the time each country is specialized from point A to point B, what's the marginal rate of transformation in each place? It's the same. So who has a comparative advantage over whom at that point? No one. We've exhausted the comparative advantage. And once you've exhausted the comparative advantage, there's no reason to keep specializing. It's only going to get worse from there. We've done everything we can do. And at that point, after specialization, what do? You trade along a terms of trade line. There's your terms of trade line. And you can trade, give up some wheat in the U.S. for some rice from China. And you get out here to point C on the new community indifference curve. And what does China do? Missed it, but you get the idea. Community indifference curve there to point C. And what is each country doing? They're going from A to B, specialization, and then they're trading from B out to C, B out to C, and what happens in each country? Not only do they get outside of their production possibility curves, but where do they end up? At a higher level of social welfare according to the community indifference curves. And that, in a nutshell, is the same thing. And if you notice, we've cleaned up both of those 2 problems. First problem, partial specialization instead of complete specialization. Why didn't they keep going? Because there was no more comparative advantage to be had. Where did they end up? Outside of their production possibility curves, but more importantly, a higher level of social welfare. And this is an example of modern trade theory based on factor endowments that's much more realistic. It captures some of the things going on in the real world. And let me spend a little bit of time talking about what those things are and why they're important. And this model should look the exact same with the noted exceptions as our first model that we did with Adam Smith. And so if you can walk through the math in that one, you can walk through the math in this one. It's just a matter of specializing, giving up making one thing, using those resources to make more of something else, and then giving up some of that for some of something else from the other country. It's the same process. Where's my... Yeah, here we go. A couple of things that happen. As before, we specialize in the direction of the comparative advantage. We trade for the thing in which you have a comparative disadvantage. You get to a higher level of social welfare. All that stuff we just said is true here. But there's also some interesting real-world things that come out of this model that are worth noting. One is this idea of factor price equalization. Remember, in China, at the beginning of this model, labor was abundant and cheap. As they specialize in the production of rice, what happens to the demand for that labor? As they're making more and more rice, what do they need? Yeah, they need more and more people to go to work, don't they? What does an increase in demand for something do to its price or wage rate? It pushes it up. So what was cheap initially, as they specialize, comes into higher demand, and the price of labor goes up. Guess what we've been seeing in China over the past 20 or 30 years with wage rates? As they've specialized in manufactured goods and the things that they specialize in China, we've seen a middle class starting to grow, haven't we? Because that labor has come into higher and higher demand. So it wasn't really cheap to begin with, but now it's kind of starting to climb a little bit. Now, what about labor in the U.S.? Historically, we were paying workers really well to make these manufactured goods, but as we started having China do it, what happened to their wage rates? They come down. Do you see how they're equalizing? Matter of fact, trade will continue to occur until those factor prices, the wage rates for these particular goods, are equalized. And at that point, there's no comparative advantage. That's what's going on. So this real world thing where you hear people saying, I can't compete with these cheap Chinese workers. Well, yeah, that's the whole point. That's their comparative advantage. But over time, those things will equalize. We do see income distribution issues because as laborers in this country, as we've seen their wage rates come down, we've seen the owners, in this example, of capital resources going up. Just like wage rates in China are climbing, capital rates in the U.S. would be climbing. And so there's some winners and losers, and that's income distribution or income redistribution issues that occur as a result of this. And again, that's a very realistic part of free trade. It's really the biggest gripe people have. The place where this has really reared its head over the past 40 or 50 years in this country has to do with not the distinction between labor and capital, which is the example we just used for illustration purposes. The place we've seen this really playing out in this country has to do with the tension between skilled and unskilled labor. When we talk about unskilled factory worker jobs, these are jobs such as, putting the cap on the bottle and moving it down the assembly line, putting the cap on the bottle, moving it down the assembly line, putting the cap on the bottle, moving it down the assembly line. Do you see the repetition and mechanical process I'm talking about here? Now, we used to have workers doing that kind of stuff. And we refer to that as unskilled labor because even though it might take some dexterity and some quick handwork, you don't have to think about what you're doing. It's very mindless, repetitive, mechanical type work. And that's kind of a typical unskilled labor position. On the other hand, what I'm doing right now, education, is considered skilled labor. You got to have a higher degree. You got to think about what you're doing. It requires a certain level of technical expertise or professional or academic expertise to do these things. Guess what does repetitive mechanical work better than people?
Machines.
Yeah, machines tend to do that. So over the past 50 years, two things have been going on. One thing that's been going on is we've been advancing robotics machines and computer technology, and we've been able to computerize a lot of the production process and roboticize a lot of the production process. And what has that done to unskilled worker positions in this country?
Put them out.
Yeah, it's crowded them out. It's pushed them out. Another thing that's been going on over the past 50 or 60 years, as China's economy has developed and other countries, underdeveloped countries, have started to develop, they've started doing some of these unskilled labor positions for us, and that's also cost us jobs. So if you think about it, unskilled labor in this country has been under a two-front attack. Unskilled labor has had to fight against the machines, and they've had to fight against cheap foreign labor. And they've lost, but that's okay. That's specialization. What has that freed up our labor to do? If the unskilled jobs are going away, yeah, we've got to get more skills. So what does that? It's not free, right? You got to go back to school. You've got to go through the steps it takes to get there because you need certain levels of technical expertise that I mentioned to do these skilled labor positions. And we're starting to see that we actually lost some of them. There's been a lot of push to get back some of the trade skills that we've lost. And all of that's kind of bundled up in the same discussion. But the question is, what has been more damaging to unskilled labor in this country? Has it been the machines or has it been free trade? If you listen to the people talking about it, they're always talking about how evil free trade is and these bad deals we've cut with other countries. But if you want to know what the data says, it's actually the machines that have wiped it out. It's about tenfold number of jobs that were replaced by machines rather than by free trade. Matter of fact, free trade has created a lot of jobs. It's just in other areas. Typically speaking, technological change, what we call biased technological change, that's machines taking over for people. That's been a lot more damaging to the unskilled labor. And once it gets away with that job, it's just gone. It doesn't necessarily create a whole bunch of new jobs. It may create a few to man the machines, right? And you see examples of this all day long. Go to Kroger, and what do you notice about the checkout lanes?
More self-service.
Yeah, more self-service. It's a machine doing it instead of the cashiers, right? That's an example of biased technological change. We call it biased technological change because it seems to be biased against unskilled workers, whereas technology seems to assist high-skilled workers. And guess what is a perfect example of that right now? What's all this technology doing for me? The fact that I can record these things I can transmit to another satellite campus. Is the technology replacing me?
No.
Not yet. But what's it doing?
Freeing up some of your time.
Yeah, it's enhancing it's making me more productive. So technology seems to really like high-skilled workers and help them out like an MRI machine helps out an orthopedic surgeon. They don't have to go operating as much. They can look right into your knee before they go cutting into it. That frees up a lot of their time to do other things. It makes them more productive, whereas robotics tend to just knock low-skilled workers out of the mix. An example of, so I mentioned that most pundits out there, people who are making arguments, will always criticize free trade. They're always going after free trade because it's easy to pick on foreigners, I guess, whatever, even though it's technology that seems to be doing more damage to low-skilled positions. And we also have to be careful because not a lot of us want those low-skilled jobs. There are some available in this country, just most of us don't want them because we have other opportunities. Whereas most people are quick to criticize free trade, even though it actually does a pretty good job considering what it's actually doing. And no one tends to criticize technology because to go out against technology, to say that modern technology is bad, makes you sound like a Luddite or an anti-scientific person. You don't see a lot of that. But there is one group that actually argues just that. They actually are pro-free trade, but anti-technology. And the group that I'm referring to is the California Dock Workers Union. The Association of California Dock Workers love free trade. Why do dock workers want more free trade?
Imports.
Yeah, more boats to unload, right? That's more work for them. Why do they not like machines? Guess what unloads a boat better than people? Yeah, machines do. You can automate basically all of the shipping industry now. We have the technology. We've long had the technology to do that. But every year, the California dock workers make sure when they're negotiating their labor contracts that it's explicit that no one will lose their job to a machine. So they're an example of those who argue against technology but for free trade, which is kind of a nice example to kind of throw in there. Okay. So that's modern trade theory. Got through that pretty quickly. We've got a little bit more to do here, but the last bit has to do with exceptions to the rule. So now we're going to shift gears and say, okay, comparative advantage is a very intuitive and strong model that really captures how things have evolved around the world, why countries specialize in particular things, why they trade for other things, and it shows us how we've all gained, how it's made us more efficient. And markets are always striving for efficiency, so markets are always pushing towards this. It's only political interests and other interests that try to kind of pull us away from this. But the markets are always kind of pushing towards more efficiency, and so since free trade and comparative advantage is a more efficient use of our global resources, it's always going to be kind of the direction that the markets are going. There are some examples, though, where free trade doesn't work. And let me give you a few examples real fast here. Regulations are an example that can throw off comparative advantage. So the question is, why do we not see comparative advantage working? Well, it might be that you have some rules and regulations that just prevent it. You may have countries that are restricting free trade based on laws, like North Korea restricting a lot of trade. And those regulations obviously prevent the models from showing us what they can do in the real world. You can have tariffs and quotas and other public policy that restrict trade, and that's a reason why we don't have it. So these are kind of obvious reasons why the models may appear to fail on the surface, but really it's a violation of one of our assumptions. Infant industry is another one, and government subsidies. Infant industry just has to do with an industry that has either just started or was well developed but got knocked back by maybe a natural disaster or a war or something like that, and has to start over again. And when industries are starting off, they're small and inefficient. It's only after they've grown and realized economies of scale that they're competitive. So in some cases, you may have countries that, through no fault of their own or through a war or through a natural disaster, are just thrown so far back they have to kind of start over again. And that prevents free trade from operating the way we would expect to see it. And finally, government subsidies. You can sometimes see countries exporting things that they have a comparative disadvantage in only because the government is paying them to do it. I mean, you can do anything as long as you throw enough money at it. And you can even resist the tide of free trade by subsidizing an industry to go against it. So those are just some kind of obvious examples. Oh, product life cycle theory is one other example of how we see a violation or an apparent violation of comparative advantage. And product life cycle theory has to do with the fact that new products typically pop up in the market where there's a high demand for those products. So initially, iPhones were made in Silicon Valley in California. The research and development was done there. The first iPhones were made there. And we may have exported some to another country. But as soon as we started mass producing these things, where did production move to? China. So now we're importing iPhones from another country. So somebody might say, well, who has the comparative advantage? Both countries have exported them at different times. Well, that's the natural progression of all products. Think about the radio. The transistor radio was invented and perfected in this country, and we would export them for a while, but then Japan took over and started exporting it. Then mass production took place in China. And who's making transistor radios now? Nobody is. So they're gone. The product life cycle has completed. And throughout that time, different countries have exported it. And the main reason is because comparative advantage for something that's mass produced is different than comparative advantage for something that's a research and development new product. They're different products basically as it evolves. And it's basically seeking out comparative advantage around the world of being produced as efficiently as possible. So those are examples that appear to violate comparative advantage, but don't really. But the one I wanted to spend time on, the reason I rushed through those was to get to one of the more interesting examples that go against our model of comparative advantage. And this is the last thing for this lecture, so hang in there. Almost done. It's been a pretty short one. Intra-industry trade. Up to this point, the examples we've used, from Adam Smith's absolute advantage to Ricardo's comparative advantage to Heckscher and Olin's modern trade theory factor endowment example, all of these examples have involved two goods. That second two in the 2x2x1 or 2x2x2, that second two was two different goods. So we had two industries, and that would be what's called inter-industry trade, trade between two industries. And we had to have two different goods because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to trade within an industry. That's what intra-industry trade is. It's trade within a single industry. That's trading apples for apples, cars for cars, tomatoes for tomatoes. And you might think immediately, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why are you going to trade 5 apples for 5 apples? It doesn't do anything for either of the two parties. It doesn't make them any better off. Well, there's actually a few reasons why we do see this. If you think about it, we see a lot of it. Do we just import cars from Europe? No, we export cars to them as well. There's an example of intra-industry trade. We actually export produce to Central and South America, and then we import it right back from them. Okay, there's some tomatoes for tomatoes going on there. We might send apples to Canada, and they might send apples right back, even though apples grow in the exact same season. Why are we sending apples for apples to Canada? These are all examples of intra-industry trade, and our comparative advantage models don't capture any of that because they require two different goods to begin with. That's the nature of those models. So what are the reasons for intra-industry trade? The first is kind of trivial, but it's long borders. Take the border between, I'm not going to draw, here's the United States, there's Canada, the Great Lakes, I don't know how they look. Here's Canada, here's the U.S. You with me? There's our border. I'm just doing part of it there. Okay, you got it? Good enough? Don't be picky. We might grow apples over here in Washington State. Actually, I'm sure we do. And we might send those up to British Columbia. Likewise, they may grow apples over here somewhere near Ontario, Toronto or something. That's not exactly where it is, by the way, but go with me on this. And they might send those down to Buffalo, New York or something, right? So we're trading apples for apples. Well, think about it. You could buy your apples in British Columbia all the way over there from Ontario. The problem is that's a long bit of transportation to carry some pretty heavy apples along. It'd be cheaper just to buy them here and pay lower transportation costs. Same thing over here. They could buy their apples all the way from there, but that doesn't make sense. Let's just trade, because of the long border, transportation costs make sense to trade apples for apples. See how that's kind of trivial? And actually, we had an assumption with our original trade models that transportation costs were zero. So in a world of transportation costs, you can have a long border that can necessitate apples for apples or intra-industry trade. Seasonal variation. If you go to South America, you'll find that when it's summer here, it's winter there. So we're growing tomatoes now, and they're not. So we might be shipping our surplus tomatoes down to South America for the Olympics coming up in Brazil, right? But when it's winter here and we're not growing tomatoes, it's summer down there and they are growing tomatoes, so then they ship tomatoes back to us. So because of seasonal variation, the fact that the seasons are inverted between the northern and southern hemispheres, you can get tomatoes for tomatoes, or an example of intra-industry trade. And finally, excuse me, we have economies of scale. Economies of scale. Butchered that. If the U.S. is producing cars and we want to expand into European markets, that gives us an opportunity to expand our production. So let's say that we're relatively small manufacturers of cars. Our factories are kind of small, and when factories are small, they're fairly inefficient. But we want to expand to global markets. So what do we have to do with our factories? We've got to make them bigger, and there may be some serious economies of scale where we're now producing them a lot cheaper. Since they're cheaper, the markets are larger. More cars are bought at cheaper prices than at more expensive. So now we've actually expanded the markets. And what are they doing in Europe? They expand into the U.S. market. And to do that, what do they have to do with their factories? They've got to expand them. So both countries experience economies of scale. Both countries produce cars cheaper. More people are buying cars in each country. It's just a win-win. And you end up trading cars for cars. What we've basically done, you've just globalized the markets, and you've tapped into economies of scale. But that's a justification for why we might trade cars for cars with Europe. And that is everything.